absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone, welcome once more. It's a great pleasure to meet again and to really discuss a very important topic in the AMR space, one that I think it's not really discussed so much, but as we appreciate, it's really important to discuss it because it's something that really influences a lot of things in the AMR space. So today with us, we have two guest speakers, that is Nicola Jones and Abriti Aryjal from C for AMR. I hope we all remember Dr. Jess the other day, and Abriti from HAD International. So it's a great pleasure being with them today because they have done quite some good research before on this issue, and I'm sure they'll be sharing with us some of the experiences and some of the exposure that they have had when working in Nepal. So because of time, maybe I'll just welcome them and maybe to share a bit about themselves, and then maybe we can start off. That's okay. Over to you, Nicola and Abriti.
Thank you,
sorry,
Daniel.
that's me there. I am not able to share my video because the network is quite shaky. It might kick me out of the meeting. It's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'd just like to start by saying thank you for having us come to speak to you today about our work. I'm Nichola Jones. I'm based at the University of Leeds in the UK. I do a few things at the moment, but I'm finishing up my PhD, and some of the work that's in this presentation is going to be from my thesis. So that's the main thing that I'm here to talk to you about today. And I will just say, I'm sorry, my voice is going a little bit, so please bear with me if I'm a little bit tricky to understand. Just ask me to repeat myself. And I'll pass to Abriti now, who's one of my colleagues based in Nepal, so she can introduce herself.
Yeah, hello everyone. And yes, of course, thank you very much for having us to talk on this very important topic. And I'm based in Nepal, HAD International, and I am a public health professional and mostly engaged in research activities, particularly focusing on qualitative research, participatory approaches, and community engagement. And antimicrobial resistance is one of my core area where I have worked in a number of projects. And as Nicola mentioned, like we'll be discussing on the work that we have done collectively on antimicrobial resistance with the use of community engagement as an approach. So hope that it will be useful to you all. And yes, we can always discuss further if you all need further information. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Abriti and Nicola. Thanks so much. So I think we can now start it off, and over to you. And thanks so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Daniel. So probably I'll be starting the talk. So once again, thank you very much. So we just thought like when we are framing the presentation, we just thought like we would also briefly first discuss about what antimicrobial resistance is, so that it's easier to understand the influence of gender and sex towards the end, leading to antimicrobial resistance. So, and why it is a very important topic to be talked about. So, as per WHO, it is a global health and development threat, and it does require a multisectoral action, which means like engagement of environment, animals, and human. All three sectors need to work collaboratively to address this issue. And it is also declared as one of the top 10 global public health threats that is facing humanity. And the most the main driver of this is particularly misuse and overuse of antimicrobials in both human, animals, and also at the environment level. So yes, we could be one of the change agent to actually address the issues of AMR. So it is very important that we discuss and start addressing the issues from our side at least. So what actually antimicrobials, so just to start with what antimicrobials are. So they are medicines which actually are used to prevent and treat infections in humans and animals and plants, which is or stops the growth of microorganisms. It means like the growth of bacteria, virus, parasites, and fungi when used, and it protects us against the illness and also prevents from the death after if we get infected from these viruses and fungi and bacteria and parasites. So next slide. So there are like the most common types of antimicrobials. There are of antimicrobials, and the most common types, and some of them are like antibiotics, which is used against the antibacterial, which is used against the bacteria. So for example, like drugs for bacterial pneumonia, and antiviral, which is used against viruses, antiparasitic, which is used against parasites, and antifungals, which is used against fungi. So why we are discussing this separately is like because it is very important that we use correct antimicrobials for correct microorganisms. Otherwise, it's not going to work, and it could be one of the major factors leading to antimicrobial resistance. So it's very important that we understand the infection that is the microorganisms that actually causing the infections and infection in us, and then like getting the correct treatment that is using the correct antimicrobials for it. Next one. So then what is antimicrobial resistance? So we talked about that, like we are using different antimicrobials to treat infections caused by various microorganisms. So what happens is like the bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites, all these microorganisms, they change over time and they start to no longer respond to the antimicrobial medicines that we are using. So that situation or that context is called antimicrobial resistance, which means like the medicines that we are using, that is antimicrobial medicines, does not work over the bacteria, over the microorganisms that are causing the illness. So as a result, what happens is like drug resistance, antibiotics and other antimicrobial medicines, they become ineffective, and infections are increasingly difficult or impossible to treat, which might also lead to death of an individual, of a human or an animal. So so this is antimicrobial resistance, and there is a usual misconception among us that like many people think that it's antimicrobials that so many people think that the body get resistant to the antimicrobials, when in fact that is not true. So it's the microorganisms or that gets resistant, and the antimicrobial can't work against those microorganisms. So it's not the body that get resistant, but it's the microorganisms that get resistant and does not work, and the antimicrobial medicine does not work against it. So it's very important that we use the antimicrobials correctly. Next one. So there are different behavioral factors that are actually causing antimicrobial resistance. For instance, like overprescribing of antimicrobials. So sometimes antimicrobials might not be needed, but then like we tend to use it just to get better faster, or just because it's overprescribed by the health professionals. So that might be leading to antimicrobial resistance. And then like it's very easily and available over the counter in some countries. So like people just go and tend to get the medicines and then like use it without proper prescription or without proper visit to the health worker. So what happens is like when the what happens is like you don't know what microorganisms is causing that particular infection, and the medicines that you are using or the antimicrobials that you are using might not be the correct one. So because of that, the microorganisms that actually is causing an illness in your body might get stronger, might get might develop more immunity, so that the existing antimicrobial stops working on that microorganisms, and then like the illness is not cured, and then like it might take a longer period to cure the illness. So, and the other factor is like patients not completing full course of medicine. So it is like very important that we complete the full course of medicines so that the microorganisms are killed properly. If not, then what happens is like we just sometimes what happens is like we just take medicines for 1 or 2 days, and then we leave the medicines thinking that we are now okay and we don't need it. But then like what happens is like we feel that we are okay, but then the microorganism is not killed, or they are not gone properly. So which means that they might mutate and then like become more stronger, and then the existing antimicrobials, as I told previously, might stop working. So it is very important that we complete the full course of medicines or the antimicrobial medicines that's given to human and animals both. So consumption of animal products which contains antimicrobials. So there is this residual period, like when it is said that the animal products which contains which animals which has taken antibiotics or antimicrobials the products from them should not be used for a certain period of time, so that the residues does not enter into the human body. So it's also important that we take into consideration that we are not consuming animal products which is containing antimicrobials, and also like which animal products where the animals have been just using the antimicrobials. Next one. So lack of hygiene and poor sanitation and poor infection prevention and control mechanism. So this is basically like we should be trying to prevent the illness, so that like there does not come a situation where we'll need medicines and or the antimicrobials. So that like we save the medicines and the antimicrobials for an illness like which for future generation, and also to cure the illness properly. So another factor could be like lack of knowledge on AMR among paraprofessionals and pharmacists, which I also talked about, which I think I also linked it with the previous, that if the paraprofessionals or the pharmacist might not know which microorganisms is causing the illness. So it is very important that the diagnosis is done properly. So that lack of that knowledge among them could be leading to misuse of antimicrobials. Next one. So yes, so in summary, why AMR is a big problem, because like if antimicrobials just stops working, then it prolongs hospital stays because the infection is harder to treat, and then it also increases the cost. So when the infection is harder to treat, you might need to get more harder medicines, stronger medicines. You might need to stay at the hospitals for a longer period. So it might also lead to further disability or like different form of deformities. So it also increases the health cost, and in broadly it threatens the overall global health security and also increasing the mortality rate. So this is why AMR is a big problem, and it should be taken into account, and we should start resolving the issues for AMR from now on. Next one. Yeah, over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, Abriti. That was an excellent summary of what AMR is and sort of how it's behaviourally driven. So if I take it from there and say that if we consider AMR to be a largely driven by behaviour health issue, then in order to address these behaviours, we first need to understand where they come from, why they happen, and what influences those behaviours. So I wanted to look very specifically at gender in that question. But I think that first, it's very important to separate out what we mean by sex and gender. So the terms sex and gender are often used interchangeably, especially in health research, and in the reading that I've done around AMR, a lot of researchers use those terms sort of synonymously. They use them together very often. So what do I mean by sex and what do I mean by gender? There we go. So sex refers to the biological differences between men and women. So this is a very binary way of looking at sex, and there are, of course, people who fall outside of those two binaries, but certainly within AMR research, there isn't very much outside of those two kind of binary male and female bodies. But that's what we mean when we refer to sex and those biological differences. And then when we talk about gender, we're really talking about those kind of socially constructed behaviours that are assigned to each sex. So there's a really strong relationship between sex and gender, and I think that's why they often get used interchangeably. But really, when we talk about gender, we talk about those kind of behaviours that we relate to masculine or feminine. And it's really important to note here as well that actually what we consider to be very masculine or feminine can change by culture, by location, and even over time. So the things that we consider very masculine currently in modern day might not have been very masculine 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So these ideas are very socially constructed, they're very of the time. And that's what I want to look at today, those sort of gendered behaviours and how they can influence AMR. So why does gender matter when we're looking at AMR? Well, the first thing to say is that there isn't very much literature on the topic. So there is a lot of, or quite a bit of information, should I say, that links sex. There's a lot of information that we have based on sex desegregated data. So what that means is that a lot of the information that we have separates out patterns in things like AMR prescribing or in occurrence of AMR infections by sex. And often those reports use terms like gender, but often what they're referring to then is just those binary terms of male and female in terms of things like prescription rates. And often those papers conclude that there needs to be more research into why these trends actually happen by sex. So to give you some examples from my reading, we know that there are trends in prevalence around certain AMR factors. So for example, urinary tract infections are typically most common in older men, meaning that they tend to receive more antibiotic prescriptions as a demographic. One study in Germany found that more men than women experience AMR infections nationally. And we also know that biologically, women are more likely at certain points in their life to require antimicrobial treatments, especially around factors like childbirth. So we do know that there are sex-based issues and health factors, but we can't always understand why these trends happen. So if I go back for a moment to the example from Germany, where we saw that more men than women were getting AMR infections, the author of that paper couldn't highlight why that was happening, but did suggest that there is a pattern in hand washing practices that differ by men and women. So what we have there is something that's not occurring biologically. So men aren't just more predisposed to those types of infections, or not necessarily. What the author suggests is that it might be more down to sort of hygiene practices that are very gender specific. So women tend to wash their hands a lot more often than men, and that can relate to various parts of social expectations around food preparation, around caring for children, etc. So what's happening there in theory is that men are being more exposed to harmful bacteria because of a set of behaviours that are rooted in their gendered behaviours. So my PhD, ultimately, the aim was to look at data, a set of qualitative data through a gendered lens, to bring a deeper understanding of those mechanisms that drive AMR and the barriers to change and the opportunities that come within a community. So I'm going to pass over to Abriti in a moment. She's going to talk to us a little bit more about one of the project, should I say, that was used in this paper. It was a community-based project in Nepal. And what we tried to do, which we'll go into sort of in a few moments, is how we looked at the data that was gathered within that project through this gendered lens. So if I hand over now to Abriti, she'll talk you through the Karen project in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. So yes, Community Arts Against Antibiotic Resistance in Nepal. So it is an art-based participatory intervention, so which actually aimed at developing community-led approaches against antibiotic resistance in Nepal. So we did this study in 2017, and Nicola will be further talking about later how about using the gender lens into the findings and how it influenced the behaviors of the participants. But then before that, just to take you through what we actually did in this study. Next slide, please. Yes, as I mentioned, so it's a participatory art-based intervention. So in this, like, we tried to, the objective was particularly to identify the issues and gaps in addressing antimicrobial resistance at community level, and also try and co-create community level solutions. And we further tried to disseminate the identified issues and solutions in the form of films at various levels, including national, international, and also at community levels, where and the community level was more led by the community participants themselves. So that is why we call it like community-led approaches against antibiotic resistance. Next. In this intervention, community engagement and co-creation was an integral component, and was also linked with the policy engagement. So community people were engaged in exploring and identifying the issues leading to AMR in their community context, in their local context. And based on that understanding, they developed audio visuals materials as films, and showing the issues and solutions of leading to antimicrobial resistance, which were further disseminated at both local and national levels. So what happened is, like, after engaging the community people themselves, the film actually helped to capture the local context and local issues, and the community people and participants themselves were seen in the films, which made the films more influential and impactful. So that showed the power of community engagement as such when we are trying to address various issues, including antimicrobial resistance. Next one. So reflecting back, like, on what this led to was, like, there was a greater understanding. So what the use of community engaged approach led to was that, like, there was a greater understanding on AMR and need for prioritizing the issues. So the local issues and the needs were understood better, and the community engagement approach that we applied had a greater impact on the stakeholders, and that led to commitment from the policy actors at local level to address the issues and various other factors that were leading to AMR in the community. So yeah, next one. So after applying this community engagement as an approach, so some of the key lessons that we have learned on how we should be applying community engagement approach, or what this is actually, what this actually leads to is, like, it's not a one-go process. So community engagement is a continuous process, and it's not a one-go process. So we should take the engagement, so we should respect that and we understood that we should respect that not all the stakeholders are informed on the topic, and thus we should try and communicate appropriately in a language they understand, and further bringing community champions up front and identifying them from the community and making them engage with the stakeholders added a value, as they were the real change agent and advocates for the community in addressing the antimicrobial resistance. So further, this created a platforms for dialogues and sharing that helped in policy uptake of the issues. At last, so this process of co-creation and engaging stakeholders should actually be adapted to the local context that we are working in. So because like although there are similarities in various contexts and issues, but then like there are variation and differences as well that exist in each community, even in one country, like it might differ for different issues. So the community engagement approach itself should be adapted and contextualized based on the approaches. So yeah, this is what we did and what that actually led to and what key messages we learned after applying community engagement approach and trying to identify the community-led solutions from the community participants themselves. So yes, Nicola, over to you.
Thank you. Excuse me. So thank you, Abriti. So the Karen program, the Karen project, should I say, sorry, came up with this huge wealth of information about those community knowledges, attitudes and practices around AMR. They came up with all these community generated solutions. But one thing that I think is really important to sort of really state here is that the Karen project in its original form never actually intended to look at gender specifically. So the questions were very broadly based around community behaviours. But when we started to look at that data, even just very briefly, we started to see that there were really interesting gender dynamics that came out in that. And then from the sort of wider reading of the literature that I spoke about earlier, we realised that there really just isn't much information that links those sort of two concepts together, the sort of the gendered health behaviours and the AMR. So what I did was take an existing health systems research framework that looks very specifically at gendered dimensions of a health system. And I adapted it very slightly just to make it more specific to AMR issues. And really, all it asks very simply is these four main questions of who has what, who does what, how are values defined, and who decides. So when we're asking who has what, we're looking at things like access to knowledge, to services, and also things like paid employment and education and financial resources, and then how they kind of relate to antimicrobials for human or animal health. When we look at who does what, we're looking at things like the division of labour within and beyond the household. So who is it that's taking part in paid work? Who is doing the care duties around the home? Who is taking part in self-care as well as care for others and care for the animals within small holdings? How are values defined is looking at social norms and ideologies and perceptions and kind of shared beliefs that relate to the seeking, use and disposal of antimicrobials. And that again is either for human or animal health. And there's this really strong interface there between sort of human and animal health, and certainly within some of these communities where small holdings are really common. And then finally, who decides? So who makes the rules, who decides within the household and also slightly externally, but primarily this question looks at the household level. Who is making those decisions formally as well as informally that might result in the acquisition and use of antibiotics or antimicrobials, again, for human or animal health. So in applying that analysis framework, I think that you might have already had access to the full paper, but I put a QR code here in case anyone wants to look at the full paper. There were quite a lot of findings that came out, and in my opinion, they were very interesting and really illuminating. But I just want to give a very brief overview here of each one. So under who has what, some of the main themes that came out were around access and knowledge. So women tended to have access to local health posts, which are free government provided services that are based quite locally within communities. And by contrast, men tended to have access to things that were paid at the point of service, especially private pharmacies, which again are very, very common in Nepal. And then men also had quite high access to things like hospitals and doctor's appointments. So there are barriers within that, but actually because women have a limited access to paid at the point of service healthcare, women tended to only really seek sort of formal health advice and care from these health posts by trained professionals, whereas men were more unlikely to attend those health posts and are therefore kind of potentially at risk of misusing antibiotics more so than women within those communities. And that applies also to animal care, where there are private pharmacies and veterinary pharmacies for animal care. Men tend to be the ones who kind of seek the care for their animals. So when we look at who does what, perhaps unsurprisingly, women are expected to provide the majority of healthcare for children. So when it comes to seeking healthcare for themselves, women describe themselves as likely to attend health posts. However, there was some reluctance from a lot of the female participants around things like seeking tablets and prescriptions. Participants then, by contrast, stated that men are more likely to seek antibiotics without a prescription. So where women tend to attend health appointments at the health posts, men tend to seek healthcare at private pharmacies. And it was an interesting point as well that women often described as having to attend a health appointment or a health post once they had completed all of their household chores, which is something that the male participants never really referenced at all. So there's a really strong gender difference there in who does what around the household and how that impacts who seeks healthcare and when. So when we look at how values are defined, female participants tended to trust herbal remedies and traditional healers. So there were quite a few examples within the workshops, within the transcripts, and within the films themselves of women leaning into traditional healers and things like homeopathic remedies. So women reference things like giving children hot water, giving them rest, giving them homeopathic remedies before they would seek healthcare from a doctor necessarily. And of course, that would vary from case to case, depending on the severity of the illness. But as a general rule, women tended to kind of lean more towards those homeopathic remedies, whereas men tended first to describe going to sort of paid at the point of service health providers, so private pharmacies mostly. And one of the reasons that men gave for that was that they wanted to be given strong medications. So there was a strong distrust of among male participants around traditional healers and around health posts. So there's this really interesting contrast coming out around those sort of gendered perceptions of different health posts, and where women tended to trust those kind of perhaps lower level interventions, men tended to distrust them completely and were often describing medications at those services as being too weak to treat their illnesses quickly. They were concerned that the staff at the health posts are not as competent as doctors that they would pay for. Male participants described private pharmacists as trustworthy and reliable sources of information and medicine. And again, linking to who does what around the household, childcare is often seen as a feminine role within the house. So male participants often describe that they would trust their wives and partners to do all of those childcare duties. And then finally, under who decides, female participants describe needing to seek permission from husbands. And again, this does vary from case to case. It's a very small participant group, so I don't want to give the impression that these represent everything that happens across even these communities in Nepal. But what was coming out of these very small kind of very rich discussions was that the participants were referencing a need for wives to ask their husbands if they could first go to the healthcare post. And what often happened then in response was that the husbands would say, oh, don't waste the day at the health posts. I'll go and buy you some antibiotics on my way home from work. And then the participants described that in some instances where women went against those kind of wishes or advice from the men in their lives, that there could be potential violent repercussions. So again, I don't want to give the impression that this is completely common practice across all of Nepal. There is a lot of variation. There was some sort of indications that women who had paid work, that sort of younger women who worked in paid jobs tended to behave in a more sort of typically male way, that they sought healthcare from private pharmacies as well, but that typically speaking, men were the ones who kind of engaged in these behaviours. And there was one interesting outlier that I want to highlight as well, that though men are seen as the decision makers within the household, when participants had watched the films, there was this interesting feedback from one of the male audience members who said his daughter influenced his health behaviours since viewing the films, because she was able to describe to him the benefits of going to a doctor at the health posts rather than a private pharmacy for seeking healthcare for a health issue that he had. And one final thing that I want to just mention about the films themselves specifically is that when it comes to looking at them through a gendered lens, what we found as researchers was that there's a really acute need for looking very carefully at how we share these films. So the participants within the Karen project made these films to reflect common practices in daily life. And one of the things that we found in those analyses was that there were sometimes messages that were reinforcing gendered sort of behaviour patterns and power dynamics and stereotypes within those communities. So we really just want to highlight that the films that are made within these types of projects can be really useful tools, absolutely as a research tool to look at what's happening in those communities, but that they might not necessarily be able to be shared more widely without some kind of reflection from the researchers about how the messages can be gendered and how that might be potentially harmful in moving forwards and trying to kind of move away from heavily sort of patriarchal values. So that's everything that I want to say. I'm going to hand over now to Abriti, who's going to talk you through sort of how we might apply some of these findings moving forwards, and how we are looking to apply them in projects that we're working on now. Oh, Abriti, sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. As we saw in the previous slides, there were various behaviors that actually were leading to antimicrobial resistance that we talked about in the very beginning of the presentation, and we could see like how gender has played a role there in making decisions or influencing various behaviors among men and women. So this suggests that there exist gender differences in activities and behaviors that actually is leading to antimicrobial resistance, and those are very specific, and thus it requires the contextual interventions where the gender norms and gender values are also addressed within the intervention. So, and also what she mentioned, like we didn't thought about looking at the Karen outputs. I mean, like from the very beginning of the study that we'll look at gender, but then like when the findings came out, we analyze it. But then like if we are thinking to look at anything from a gender lens, it is very important that we take that into account from the very beginning, and where in the process like we should consider the gender approaches or the gender dimension, and ideally it should be considered in all the stages of the programs or the interventions or the research that we are planning to do or that we are thinking to do if we actually want to incorporate sex and gender into the interventions. So not integrating it or not incorporating those dimensions in the beginning and just trying to look at it at the end when the output is there might not give you a full picture or might not give you an abundant information where you actually can analyze or analyze the information based on the gender or sex. So some example like how we are planning to look and how different interventions and programs can be looked at into gender if we want to incorporate gender dimension. So it should start from the very beginning of the coordination and participation phase. So this is just a list of just an example of different phases, like where and how you can try and incorporate the gender lens from the very beginning, so that like you don't miss out the bigger picture. And when you are trying to analyze or we are trying to showcase the information from the gender dimension. So it really starts from the very beginning of the projects. That is when you are thinking or doing a coordination or participation, looking at the, participation with different stakeholders. So for instance, like you are planning a meeting with the stakeholders to sensitize about the project or to talk about the research idea. So you should start thinking from there that how the different gender groups have been able to participate in all the design, planning and implementation phases. For instance, like it could just be a male group of participants who are engaged in the design, planning and implementation. So but then like we need to ensure like when we are inviting the participants that both the gender and not both the gender, but then like all the gender groups are engaged, so that their views and their perceptions are also incorporated already from the very beginning into the design and planning phase. So when we as a researcher or a programmer or as an intervener, we are designing or developing the projects, we should try and use, it would be effective if we try and use the gender analysis framework, and also in the sample design, if we try and disaggregate data by sex and gender within the sample design already in the very beginning during the planning phase. And it is also very important that we have an objective or a research question or an analysis question based on gender, because like we always look at the objective or the analysis question when we are analyzing the information on what we are actually wanting to come up with, or what we actually want to come up with. So it will add a value, like if the research questions or the analysis questions are also considered from a gender dimensions. And further, when we move to the implementation data collection, so we should be including like gender specific questions in different data collection tools. So just by using the same tool that we have been using previously might not give us the gender dimensions or the gender related information. So we should very cautiously, and then thinking that we want to look at the information from a gender perspective, we should keep that question like, okay, for instance, how is it different for male? Or how is it different for women? So if you are going to a pharmacist, if the pharmacy is the first point of contact of care, then how is it different for a woman? And what is, as a woman, what is making you decide that to go to the pharmacy and not to the health and not to the hospitals? So those sort of things those sort of questions needs to be adapted in the data collection tools. And when we are implementing, we need to also ensure that the process is actually not affected by the gender power relations. So there exists this gender power relation, which might be influencing our interventions or the programs or the research that we have designed. So we should be very, very cautiously looking at that, and so that it's not diluted. For instance, like who are the participants and the respondents? Like we might need a separate male and female group. So keeping both male and female group in one intervention package might not be effective because of the context or the way they are speaking. So we should be considering also that, and who is the facilitator or the data collector. Men might be more comfortable with men, or female might be more comfortable with female. So those sort of things. And then like who is present during the data collection or discussions, like other family members in front of whom they might or might not want to speak, and many other, like their supervisors, or so many other things we need to be considering. And obviously, yes, what intervention would be needed for different genders. So there might be gender specific interventions that might be needed. So these are the things that we should be thinking about when we are implementing and collecting data, if we want to look at the gender dimensions in the AMR interventions or programs. So further down, when we are in the analysis phase, so we also there we should incorporate like intersectional gender dimensions, or just intersectional dimensions, or the gender dimensions into the analysis of the data. That is true when we are using the variables and coding framework. So when we code, it basically it's for both I think quantitative and qualitative. Like when we list down the variables, or when we list down the codes, we should also think about the gender dimensions, and then like prepare the codes accordingly. And so yes, and it is very important that we disaggregate for the analysis phase. It is very important that we disaggregate the data by sex and other social stratifiers already in the beginning. Otherwise, like we might not have the data, like which information is from a male, or which information is from a female, or men or women, or from other or based on their age or education. And yeah, and as already mentioned, like gender framework is important to be incorporated in the data collection tools. So it's not only until analysis. So when we are even disseminating or writing reports, we need to again think about and apply gender lens. We usually say that we are applying gender lens and we want to apply a gender lens, but then like when we start writing, because like this is not something we might have been doing regularly, so we might tend to forget, or we might not dilute, or we might like miss analyzing information from the gender lens. So when we are disseminating or writing reports, so we should be careful that we are also applying a gender lens in the study findings, in reports and other dissemination materials, so that like we could bring the gender dimensions in the antimicrobial resistant upfront, and develop evidence that will help to further develop the interventions or programs addressing those issues and barriers. So yes, these are just some basic tips, or let's say ideas like how we could integrate gender dimensions into our work, into the work that we are doing. So yeah, I think that's all from our side. Nicola, yeah, do you want to conclude?
Yeah, thank you, Abriti. I suppose I'll just very, very quickly kind of summarize at the end. So thank you. I think that's a really good sort of summary of what we think is very important moving forwards. And I just conclude that the analysis that we've presented today from that project isn't sort of designed to give a set of solid instructions. As Abriti mentioned already, the contextualization of a project is vitally important, and there are other sort of demographic factors that are also important, so things like age and employment status, things like that. But what we hope we've given you today is a bit of an insight into how, first of all, the indication that gender is important when we're looking at these sort of behaviours around AMR and the drivers, but then an idea of how you might take that forwards in future projects. So, and then I'd like to finish by saying thank you again for having us. It's been a pleasure to speak here today. If you'd like any more information on CE for AMR or on HERD International in general, those are our websites. Our email addresses were also at the beginning of the presentation. I think you're going to get the slides shared with you as well. I think that's what Daniel mentioned. But Abriti and I are both very happy to answer any questions now. So I'd like to just open it up to questions, however that usually goes.
Okay, thanks so much, Nicola and Abriti, for that very informative presentation. I've really learned a lot on my end. So guys, as we usually do, if you have a question, you can either type it in the chat box, or maybe you can just raise your hand, and then I think you can then unmute. As we prepare, we would also want to ask one question as people gear up. Yeah, it's quite an important research, and I think gives a good guideline, given that we haven't had a lot of previous work done on this, and I think your work is really important because it's a catalyst, and it will really promote a lot of work into the field. I also wanted to ask, how then do we also look at the end result? How would you advocate for incorporating, looking at surveillance? This is resistant patterns from a gendered framework where you anonymize the data, yes, maybe to deal with all these ethical issues, but then maybe you trend. I know there's the difference between sex and gender, but what if we then look at maybe from the information that we have, what was the trajectory in terms of the number of maybe male patients who had resistant genes, and that way, what would be your comments on that? Thank you.
I think that's a really great question. And one thing I would say is it goes slightly, certainly outside of my own expertise, because I'm a qualitative researcher, so it's a little difficult for me to say exactly. But what I would reflect on is that when I was looking in the literature for information around this, the majority of the resources that I found were from sort of higher income countries with stronger surveillance systems. So there's a lot of information out there in higher income countries around things like prescription patterns and things like that. And certainly in places like the UK, where I'm based, because you can only access antibiotics with a prescription from a doctor. So there's this really large amount of information from a country like the UK on who's accessing antibiotics at what point in their life. And then that would give us this kind of really good set of trends or information on trends that we could then explore in a more qualitative fashion. But I do think there is a really large gap in the literature when it comes to lower income countries around surveillance. And that is not just impactful then on the gender patterns, but on everything. But certainly then I would be interested in knowing sort of what those trends are in the beginning. So we'd sort of go into those desegregation areas around certain demographics, around gender and age, etc. And then maybe after we've gotten to that point, we could ask more qualitatively, perhaps, sort of what drives those behaviours, what makes those trends happen, because they're not necessarily all based in biology. So there might be that some people are more disposed to certain illnesses at certain points in their life, or that men are more exposed to certain illnesses than women, or vice versa. But that a lot of these sort of trends in AMR are actually based around behaviours is something that's really interesting. So I'm not sure if Abriti wants to add anything as well, but that's sort of my response to that question.
Oh yeah, that's fine, Nicola. Yeah. It seems like there's another question in the chat box.
Yeah, I've just seen the chat box now. Abriti, do you want to go ahead and take this one?
Yeah, sure. Yes, the sorry. Yeah. Yes, the findings are particularly from Nepal, so less likely that it can be generalizable to a global picture, because the context and the it differs. So maybe, for instance, is education, or let's say gender, but then the context and the behaviors that exist in each country or each community could be different. So what we just discussed is kind of giving or explaining the process, how we do a community engagement activity and how we look at the gender information comes out from those community engagement activities. As I also mentioned in the presentation, it is very contextual. It has to be contextualized. It has to be tailored to the local context. So yes, so if we want to know the information from a gender perspective in Africa, so I would suggest that we should we could use the method and adapt the method and tailor the method to the context in Africa, and then do the study and look at the findings and how it is gendered, and different gender dimensions have influenced different behaviors leading to AMR. So yeah, I hope that answers. Or Nicola, if you want to add anything more.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the method itself is what is more transferable, and as Abriti says, it's the context is so key to those messages being effective, that it would be impossible to take the findings from Nepal and apply them anywhere else. But that's kind of, it's not really the aim of that study then. It's the aim is to be contextually appropriate, but then the method itself, as Abriti says, is much more sort of transferable.
Yeah, and probably that is the reason why we are saying like co-creation leading to a community-led solution. So the community is different for each context and each community. Even in Nepal, if I do that study in a different place or different city, then the information or the solutions that comes up or the issues or the barriers that exist could be different, are different. So that is why we are not using a blanket approach, and we are using a co-creation approach where the solutions are led by the community, which means the real needs or the real barriers are addressed rather than the assumptions made at the broader level. Yeah, so yeah, okay. So there is again another one. I want to find out what challenges you faced in implementing such an overall concept. Okay. Okay, yeah, so it is actually challenging and interesting as well, like because what we did was trying to develop in our like participatory approach or the community engagement approach, we introduced participatory video making as a method. So where the participants were actually trying to make the films or the let's say the audiovisual materials based on the issues that was discussed and that is discussed during the community, and then showcase it. So first it is so yeah, there were challenges actually. Yeah, so gaining the insights from the community, bringing them together and making them understand the concept, and making them participate in the process is actually challenging, because like they come from a diverse group and they have different level of understanding, and they have different expectations. But then like when you discuss as a team, and then like when you start co-creating, like it does give you a sense of what actually exist in the community, and then like they start internalizing it. And for the antimicrobial resistance as such, the major challenge was like it is a topic which is kind of scientific, and not everyone at the community level would know or would have that understanding of antimicrobial resistance. And it is difficult to make them understand everything scientifically, or let's say biologically, in a short period of time, or even if the time period is long because of different education background and others. So getting that correct, and when you are creating an output and engaging with them, and then like the output as a film, and which you will be disseminating to the wider audience. So getting that information correct, and then like bringing them together and making them understand those concepts, and trying to make the concept that is actually correct and widely acceptable, was another challenge that we thought we faced because of the particular topic, antimicrobial resistance. Had it been a social issue or a social area, let's say violence, or let's say like behaviors or something like that, so it might have been a different case. Yeah, over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, Abriti. I think it's really tricky to answer the question you've asked, Michael. I suppose there isn't really an answer that I can give right now, because the study that we used in the paper obviously is based in Nepal, but even within Nepal, it's just a very small context. So as Abriti mentioned, even if you took the same exact study and did it, you know, on the opposite side of the country, then you would find a really very different set of results. I think that I would say that something that's really come out for me strongly over the last sort of few years in looking at all of this work is just how important contextualization is. So it's not really that I could sort of directly compare Nepal to anywhere else in the world necessarily, because I don't know that that's the sort of most useful way of looking at it. It's instead sort of asking what the methods could be that would be transferable and easily kind of understood in different contexts. So we've tried to kind of look at the methods that were used in Karen, and build out a sort of a next sort of handbook that explains very thoroughly sort of what AMR is from a One Health perspective, so that facilitators could pick up this sort of useful tool in theory and be able to apply this in context. I think that hopefully in the next few years, when there's much more information out there about sort of these specific topics, we will be able to make comparisons, and we will be able to kind of look a little bit more at sort of what we can understand. But because this kind of stands alone as it's a novel project in itself, because the Karen project was very novel with its use of video, and then we've kind of applied a fairly novel analysis approach, there's nothing really that we can compare it to directly. But I hope that we will be able to start making those comparisons at some point in the near future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicola and Abriti, for that really wonderful and very insightful presentation. I appreciate that at least you have pioneered in this field, and I'm sure that we'll have more coming up from your catalytic work. At this juncture, I would like to thank you once again for really joining us and sharing more about your work. I think as maybe we go through the full paper, in case we have any questions, maybe we reach out to you so that
yes,
you can also learn from the same. So thank you so much to our participants. Thank you so much. I believe, as we said, is also something that you can pick and hopefully see how you can contextualize it. You know, some of the interventions that you've been offered, and after understanding your, you know, the community that you're engaging in. So with that, I think now we've come to the end of the session, and I would like to give Nicola and Abriti maybe a moment to just share your final remarks, then we can wind it off. Thank you.
A final thought. Oh gosh. Thank you, Daniel. I would say that my final thought is that my hope going forwards is that there are more nuanced discussions around gendered behaviours, or just behaviours in general, and how they could be gendered when we're looking at AMR. We know that it's such an important global topic, but really what's happening on the ground and in certain communities is how we're going to start to address and change the tide, especially around the demand for antibiotics. So we have to really understand those contexts, and I hope that we can apply a very gendered lens to that, to understand how we can tailor responses and things like that. And Abriti, I don't know.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks Daniel for coordinating and everything, all the support. And yes, I think it's something similar with Nicola, that yes, community engagement is very important, and co-creation could be one of the best way to address the gendered dimensions or the gender issues leading to antimicrobial resistance at the community level, because those are something that's very embedded at the community, and you really need to dig that out, and that needs to be addressed at the community level itself, and the person need to realize it and work on it. So it could be like mixing community engagement as an approach and looking at the gender dimension could be one of the important area to addressing antimicrobial resistance at the community level. So yeah, let's see. Let's work further on this, and we hopefully will have something to say more sometimes later. So yeah, so that's all I think. Yeah, thank you everyone for attending and participating.
Thank you so much, Nicola and Abriti, and I really appreciate that you could make the time. I know it's quite late on your end, Abriti, but we do appreciate. I know also, Nicola, maybe you have other roles and other activities for the day, but we really appreciate you both for shedding some light, and congrats for doing that really great work. So at this juncture, I would like also to thank our participants. Thanks so much everyone for attending, and those who did not manage to attend, we'll share with them the recording, and I'll also share with you the recording. Yeah, so bye everyone, and do have a wonderful evening and wonderful afternoon to you, Nicola. Bye, and wonderful evening, Abriti. Bye bye.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
You so much. Thank you. Bye.